Здравствуйте. Сәлеметсіздер ме, құрметті әріптестер? Құрметті профессор Александра Ван Путте бұл кісінде келген үшін сіздерді университет шаңырағында көргенімізге біз қуаныштымыз. Оның үстіне бізде университетте салтанатты көңіл күйдеміз, өйткені мамыр айының 22-23-інде университетімізге 30 жыл толады, соған арналған іс-шаралар күнде өтіп жатыр. Бұл 30 жылдық тек өткенді қорытындылайтын уақыт қана емес, сонымен қатар болашақ бағыт-бағдарымызды айқындайтын маңызды кезең. Оны біздің ұжым жақсы түсінеді. Бүгінгі лекция корпоративтік басқару 4.0 өзгерістер жағдайында тұрақтылық пен бейімделуді қамтамасыз ететін директорлар кеңесі тақырыбына арналған. Бұл ұйымдардың қарқынды өзгеріп жатқан әлемде тұрақтылықты сақтай отырып, икемділігін жоғалтпау жолдары туралы әңгіме. Осы сыртқы ортаның қалай өзгеріп жатқанын көріп отырмыз. Технологияларды ықпалы артуда. Тұрақты дамуға қойылатын талаптар күшеюде. Белгісіздік деңгейі өсуде. Яғни күрделі кезең деген сөз ғой. Осындай жағдайда тек стратегия ғана емес, оны дер кезінде қайта қарау қабілеті де шешуші рөл атқарады. Дәл осы тұста директорлар кеңесінің маңызы арта түседі. Ол бағыт-бағдар айқындайтын, бақылау мен даму арасындағы тепе-теңдікті сақтайтын және ұзақ мерзімді күн тәртібін қалыптастыратын орган ретінде ерекше мәнге ие, оны біз көріп мойындап келе жатырмыз. Сондықтан бүгін арамызда профессор Ван Путтенің болуы біз үшін үлкен мәртебе. Оның тәжірибесі, менен де гөрі жақсы білесіздер, стратегиялық ойлау мен практиканың үйлесімі Shell International және дүниежүзілік экономикалық форумдағы қызметінен бастап, қазіргі таңдағы жұмысына дейін корпоративті басқарудың заманауи тәсілдерін дамытуға үлес қосып келеді. Оның көзқарасы бізге өзгерістер жағдайындағы басқарудың рөлін жаңаша бағалауға және алдағы жұмысымыз үшін нақты бағдар табуға мүмкіндік береді деп сенеміз. Сондықтан да құрметті қонағымызға қош келдіңіздер дей отырып, сіздердің аттарыңыздан бізге сөз беруге рұқсат етіңіздер.
Well, Mr. Rector, also Mr. Chairman, my dear friend, Dr. Kalembetov. Also, thank you, Ambassador de Meyer, for coming, the Ambassador of Belgium to Kazakhstan. And many of my friends here and former colleagues, many faces actually I do recognize. Thank you for having me, and especially at the time of the 30th anniversary of ENU. Some of you may know that I've served on the board of Eurasian National University when Miras Daulenov was actually the chairman of the board. This was until about 4 years ago. So today I'm going to talk about something which is very close to my heart, which is actually corporate governance. And unfortunately, corporate governance is not yet fit for purpose. And it's not in Kazakhstan, it's anywhere in the world that we actually need to have corporate governance evolve. The title of my presentation is Corporate Governance 4.0, the ambidextrous board in the age of disruption. And before I start my presentation, let me also explain what the title means. Corporate Governance 4.0 is a form of corporate governance that works in any environment, independent of any corporate governance code. I refer to it as a meta level of corporate governance. That's number one. So whether you are operating in Kazakhstan or whether you're in a different legal jurisdiction, corporate governance 4.0 works equally well. Number two is the ambidextrous board. Ambidexterity means that we're equally able to look at compliance, but also at performance. And when it comes to performance, there's also a different element that we will be exploring it. It's beyond the traditional short-term performance, but also it looks at performance in an environment that is increasingly disrupted from the outside. And that's why I also refer to it as the age of disruption. This is much more than just change. This is something that is fundamentally altering the way that societies, but also boards, need to govern. And the emphasis is on governing. It's not on managing, which is the role of executive management. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today not only applies to corporates, I would also argue it applies to governments. A good friend of mine who used to be a colleague at the World Economic Forum said to me, why just don't call it governance 4.0 as opposed to corporate governance 4.0? Because ambidexterity is something that any government should also take into account. Let's get started. This is the agenda. 4 topics. First of all, we're going to be talking about disruptive risk and resilience. Number 2, we're going to be looking at the evolution of corporate governance and within the context of modern era, because obviously I'm not going to go back to the time when we had the East Indian Company. I'm going to go back to the 1980s. And then we're going to be looking at what does it mean to have an ambidextrous board or ambidextrous governance body. And finally, I'm going to be looking at a case study. It's a case study that I experienced in person, and it's about turning uncertainty into opportunity. Why is that important? Because very often we look at uncertainty in a negative way. I will convince you by the end of my talk that uncertainty, if we understand it and we identify it early, that we can actually turn that into an opportunity instead as being affected by risk. So what you see here is a framework that I developed back in 2004 when I was transitioning from Shell International to the World Economic Forum. It identifies 3 animals of the animal kingdom of disruptive risks: black swans, gray rhinos, and white elephants. Let's now turn to each of these one by one. Now, as both, I would probably refer to myself as a pracademic. Yes, I have a professor title, but at the same time, I work with companies either on the board or advise boards. So I always look at it, what does it mean in terms of decision making? So it's not just about identifying the kind of disruptive risks, but it's also looking at what are implications for decision making. So let's start with the first one, which is black swans. Black swans, interestingly, was identified in the 1950s as a phenomena by someone, Herman Khan, at the Hudson Institute. Now, what is interesting is the definition. A black swan is an event that cannot be identified neither in time nor in place. So we cannot say it happened here and then. It has nothing to do with probabilities, as some people may try to make you believe. The question then is, if we cannot identify it neither in time nor in space, does that mean we cannot do anything about it? And the answer is yes, we can. And I will highlight in a minute what we could potentially do in case of a black swan event. So, but they also need to be material. For those that have studied accounting, they understand what materiality means. Materiality means that it must have a significant impact on the finances of a company or even a country. So a few examples of black swans are only two here. One is the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The other one is COVID-19. Some say COVID-19 was anticipated. The answer is no. We had it on the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report from the very beginning when we started it back in 2004, but not COVID-19. We had it as a generic pandemic. And so the statement of former President Obama is actually spot on. There are two aspects of it. The first aspect is, can we potentially identify a black swan in time and in space? And the answer is no, because he said there likely will come a time in which we have an airborne disease that is deadly. Did he say that it would come out of Wuhan, Hubei province in 2019? He didn't say that. The other aspect is, what do you do about it? And this is spot on. You have to see it early, you have to isolate it early, and you have to respond to it early. Ask yourself the question, did we as government leaders and business leaders see it quickly, isolate it quickly, respond to it quickly? And you will all come to the conclusion that unfortunately we did not. Number two is gray rhinos. And I was introduced to gray rhino situations by the late Pierre Wack. Pierre Wack started scenarios in the business environment when he was the head of the global business environment team at Shell. He had retired in 1984, and I started working with him back in 1985. And what Pierre told me, still I remember vividly, because I asked him, what do you mean with gray rhinos? He said, very simple, Alexander. A gray rhino means you have shades of gray. You have a range of outcomes. But also, you don't want to face an angry rhino when you have missed the weak signals. It's all about weak signal detection. How well are we versed as leaders in order to spot the weak signals in the external environment? Mostly, we aren't. We don't have peripheral vision because it's not embedded in our mindset, it's not embedded in our DNA. Those actually who do are able to turn uncertainty into an opportunity. And here is a statement 20 years after I wrote that paper in a book, The NVIDIA Way by Jensen Huang. And Jensen Huang is the CEO and the co-founder of NVIDIA. Now, the the largest company in terms of market capitalization with a $4 trillion market cap, shortly ahead of Alphabet. And he said the following, truly a spot-on statement. I'm looking to detect the weak signals. It's easy to pick up the strong signals, but I want to intercept them when they are still weak. The question is, how do you collect the weak signals? And I wrote recently an article about this. I wrote an article about how Alphabet, NVIDIA, but also the CIA and Shell actually collect weak signals. And it's through deep decentralization, but central coordination. They use a system which is called T5T emails, top 5 things. And anybody in the organization can directly send them to Jensen Huang, the CEO, who then replies every Sunday to at least 100 emails. And then every 2 weeks, there are whiteboarding sessions where they make sense of these weak signals and what it means in terms of strategy. So it's not just sufficient to identify the weak signals, it's also important in order to say, what does it mean for us? How are we going to drive our future strategy? How are we going to internalize these discontinuities in our decision-making? Finally, and 2 examples here. One is the global financial crisis, and I will talk a little bit about that later on. And number 2 is the digital-enabled logistics and transportation. When we look at digital-enabled logistic transportation, the weak signals were actually the emergence of the 4th Industrial Revolution. The 4th Industrial Revolution that emerged in 2016, as coined by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, implies that this is going to be the hybrid age. The hybrid age means it's the fusion of the physical, the digital, and the biological worlds. And that actually implies that technologies like blockchain, but also AI, can be used in order to dramatically improve digital-enabled logistics and transportation. Actually, one of the things that we're working on at the AIFC was actually making the digital-enabled New Silk Road a reality. We're not there yet, but the potential is clearly there. I will talk a little bit more about the global financial crisis a little bit later on. Finally, white elephants, when you have strong signals. When I wrote that paper, actually, black swans and gray rhinos were there, but I still had an animal missing. So I rallied my daughters behind me, which were still 4 and 6 years old, and I asked them, I need an animal that is very visible and that you cannot ignore. And they came up with a white elephant. Kudos to my daughters. But why a white elephant? Because here the writing is on the wall. I also refer to that as a Kodak moment. As a country or as an organization, you don't want to face a Kodak moment, because a Kodak moment means that you're going to have assets that are not performing anymore. And the implications for the company, but also for society, are going to be very significant. What are some of the examples that we are facing? Is global climate change, which stands at about $17 trillion on an annual basis. China's rare earths dominance. This didn't happen overnight. They carefully orchestrated that. And also Europe's energy insecurity, which again could have been completely prevented. I come from the energy sector, but policymakers and business leaders were unwilling to listen to reason. And now we're facing the consequences. So now I put this all together. And what I do here is only looking at some of the major gray rhinos and black swan events that we have experienced over the past 30 years, sorry. Now, here's a question we need to ask. Did we turn, in the case of a gray rhino situation, did we turn a uncertainty in an opportunity? That's number one. In case of a black swan event, did we see it early? Did we isolate it early? Did we respond to it early? And in all situations, I think you will agree with me that the answer is largely negative. At the bottom, I put Europe's energy insecurity, which, by the way, the weak signals were there already 20 years ago, but now it has turned into a white elephant. And we're facing the consequences, largely because of inaction by both business and government leaders. So the evolution of corporate governance now, and I will finish on a positive note, I promise you that. The evolution of corporate governance starting from the 1980s. The modern form of corporate governance all started in the United States. And initially, when you had listed companies, some of these companies were underperforming. And then private equity firms, they believed that they could make a quick buck, so to speak. In order to turn the company around, they would not be interested in the long-term success of the company, but they would be able to make a significant short-term return for the private equity firm. Companies reacted. How did they react? They actually implemented ways to fence off hostile takeovers. Through, for example, ATCAs. ATCAs are anti-takeover charter amendments. Then came the corporate scandals. Initially, it started in the United Kingdom with Maxwell, but also in continental Europe with Parmalat in Italy, Ahold in the Netherlands, and then later on also with WorldCom and Enron, and everybody has heard about Enron especially. The response was the Cadbury report. in the UK, 1992, and Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the United States. What is interesting that although it was reactive, this was very much needed. And this was in order to prevent corporate scandals. The focus was heavily on compliance. Is compliance important? For sure it is, but I would argue it's not sufficient. Then we had the global financial economic crisis. That was in 2008, which, as we will later see, was anticipated but not acted upon. But then what we did was actually a new form of governance, which I refer to as corporate governance 3.0, and that was enacted by the Walker Report in the UK, but also Dodd-Frank in the United States. Now, what these reports, acts implied was that for large financial institutions, that they should have a separate risk committee, separate from the traditional audit committee that would be looking backwards. So the risk committee would be looking forward. When I read this, I was really positively surprised because in essence, it implied that they would internalize externalities as reflected in the paper that I just discussed at the very beginning. We didn't see much of that, however, because why would it only apply to large financial institutions? Why would it not apply to a company like GE or like a company like Shell or any company that has a material impact on the way that society, in essence, operates? So I would say this is great, but it should have been more largely used by major companies around the world, whether you're listed or whether you're a private company. So then I started thinking and said, how can we actually get out of this situation? And I then came up with Corporate Governance 4.0 in 2016 as an outcomes-based governance framework. Outcomes basically means that it should focus on more sustainable, more resilient, and more inclusive business growth. If we can achieve all these three things at the same time, not only will we be able to be compliant with laws and regulations, at the same time, we will be able to contribute to the sustainable long-term success, and the society will benefit from that as well. Let me now look at the ambidextrous board. So what would it take from a governance perspective in order to arrive at an outcomes-based form of governance? And I have one slide here. It's all about balance. Remember, when I refer to ambidexterity, it's about doing two things equally well. What are those two things? Exploitation and exploration. We tend to be very good at exploitation. Exploitation assumes that disruption happens inside of the company. It doesn't. Disruption happens in markets. And therefore, if we want to not only drive sustainable, resilient, and inclusive business growth, we need to focus on experimentation at market's edge. We also need to think about creating uncontested markets. This is where the value of strategic flexibility resides. Now, I would say that based on my own work, that most companies are largely focused on exploitation, 80+%. And they haven't found yet the right balance between exploitation and exploration. NVIDIA, for example, Alphabet, other companies, they strongly focus on exploration. That doesn't mean they don't create value today, but they both create value today and they focus on where they're going to create value in the future. So it requires a different mindset. It requires that we see uncertainty not as risk, but as opportunity. That basically means we need to see the weak signals early. If, on the other hand, we don't see the weak signals and they turn into strong signals, it translates into risk. And there's only three things we can do with risk. One is we can accept it when it's within our risk appetite. Two, we can mitigate it if it can be done cost effectively. That means the benefits outweigh the cost, or we can transfer it through insurance, for example. But that's the only thing you can do with risk. There's no upside to risk. So it's much better to spot the weak signals early. Now, let's quickly talk about two short case studies, too big to fail. First of all, the global financial economic crisis. I mentioned that I used to work at the World Economic Forum. One of the teams I was managing was the global risk team. There we had a global risk, which was called a global financial economic crisis made in the United States. You can look it up. It's available from the website of the World Economic Forum. We then had in January 2007, Davos, a deep dive into that particular global risk with the financial community only. And I had on my panel several Nobel Prize winners in economics, and they were all Americans. So they knew about capital markets. And they said the following: if you act now, because some of these signals were increasingly turning strong, you can still prevent the worst from happening. Let me show you what the market capitalization was of these banks that were present in the meeting that was hosted at the World Economic Forum. And this is only the market capitalization. This is not the economic implications nor the social implications. Now, 2 years later, this is the same the same banks and their market capitalization. Note that there are two banks that are absent. One is Bear Stearns, the other one is Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers obviously went bankrupt. Then, of course, people challenge me, could this have been prevented? Well, first of all, my panelists clearly laid out that it could have been prevented, and these are some of the aspects that they mentioned. 3 have to do with regulation, the first 3. 2 have to do directly with governance, especially about enhanced transparency, but also conflicts of interest. Focus on short-termism, focus on greed. Obviously, conflicts of interest are not aligned with any form of corporate governance, far from corporate governance 4.0. The second one is a very interesting one. Why is it very interesting? Because it shows that even a large company can be disrupted by a startup. Are you familiar with ARM? I see some people nodding. I see other people looking at me. Alexander, what are you talking about? You are all familiar with ARM. Why? Because you're all using ARM's products. It's embedded in your smartphone. Your processor in your smartphone is based on an ARM architecture, whether it's an Apple iPhone or a Samsung or any other Android smartphone. Now, what ARM, a startup or a spin-off from Cambridge University, saw was the rise of the smartphone and the need to optimize for power efficiency. Intel, on the other hand, they focused on beating Moore's law. Disruption in the lab. It doesn't work. Disruption always works or always happens in the market. So, and Moore's law is doubling of capacity every 18 months. Now, later on, they didn't learn any lesson from the ARM experience. They were disrupted by NVIDIA, who through their T5T system were able to spot the weak signals. And they anticipated the rise of agentic, but also generative AI and neural networks. And if the US administration would not have bailed out Intel, Intel would have gone bankrupt. Their balance sheet was so bad that basically they would have gone bankrupt. So it's important, it's critically important to spot the weak signals early, make sense of them, and position yourself for perpetual self-disruption. Companies rarely self-disrupt. You have to self-disrupt yourself. Let me finish with a case study. It would only take 3 minutes, but it's an important case study because it was also part of that paper that I wrote in 2004. Now, in 2004, when I joined the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab asked two colleagues and myself to visit all the strategic partners in the United States. That was the beginning of September in 2004. And we arrived in California. And in California, we were asked whether we had time in the evening to visit the co-founders of a startup. I had time. My colleagues actually had an event at Stanford University. By the way, at Harvard, we refer to that as the other place. But that's a side note that Karat Kalembetov, Dr. Kalembetov here will understand well. But basically, I met the co-founders of Tesla. At the time, a very young company was only created about 9 months earlier. And I met Mark and Martin. Elon Musk was not yet part of the team. So as part of my framework, I had a line, a curved line, which I refer to as signal strength. Think about weak signals versus strong signals. 2012 here is the time of the launch of the Tesla Model S, their first electric vehicle, and also referred to as the White Star, which was the code name. Over here, we're in gray rhino territory when you have weak signals. On the right-hand side, you have a white elephant situation. That basically means that at that moment in time, it's very visible because battery electric vehicles are already on the road. So what I asked the co-founder was very simple. What are the weak signals that you see in the external environment that you believe that battery electric vehicles will become a reality? And they laid out 5 plus 1 weak signals. I never met them again, but I monitored them, and they launched the Tesla Model S exactly at the time that those weak signals were all aligned. And therefore the Tesla Model S would be a profitable product launch. But there's over here, over here, we also, it doesn't show here on the slide, but on the left-hand side, when you have gray rhinos, you have potentially blue oceans, an uncontested market. Once the market is created, you operate in red oceans. That basically means that more for you is less for me because competitors are going to compete for market share. Blue ocean indeed, and red ocean over there, but it's not finished yet. There's also the abandonment cost. When you actually experiment at market edge, the abandonment cost is actually very small. When on the other hand, you compete in a red ocean, the abandonment cost is very significant. So the cost for Tesla to launch the Tesla Model S was $380 million. Is that a lot of money? For sure. But the cumulative commitment that all automotive companies have made towards 2030 is now in excess of $1 trillion. 380 million compared to 1 trillion. That's why they have been able to capture the value of strategic flexibility. And that curve is negatively correlated with signal strength. There's one final thing. In business schools, we teach about fast follower. It doesn't work anymore. In a fast evolving environment, you have to spot the weak signals early and benefit from a first mover. This is how you can create uncontested markets. This is why we see in the United States, in China, and also Israel. I'm not sure I should be mentioning Israel today, but that's why we have so many unicorns. And that's why we don't have many unicorns in Europe, because there they still have a what? Experimental mindset at markets edge, but also they combine it with fail fast. If it doesn't work, they kill it. What Google refers to as the Google graveyard. They already killed 250 strategic options because they were not able to turn them into uncontested markets. Each of them could be an individual unicorn. Let me finish with 2 slides. This is based on my research about ambidextrous organizations applied also at country level. Obviously governed by an ambidextrous board. First of all, ambidextrous organizations have a deeply embedded and shared values that are a guide to action. Number two, they look at beyond profit. We tend to focus heavily on profit, but profit is not sufficient. And very often we look at profit in the short term. What about balancing and growing all 5 capitals? Number 3, they have peripheral vision. I'm wearing lenses, as you can all see. How well are we looking as opposed to looking through our lenses? It's in the periphery that we have the weak signals. Number 4, we need to have an experimental mindset. We need to envision those uncontested markets. This is actually where the value of strategic flexibility is captured. Number 5 is we also need to be financially conservative. With that, what is meant is that we need to make sure that debt versus equity is aligned with the challenges and opportunities within the business. If you have a capital-intensive business, you should actually use more equity than debt. Many companies, and especially countries, violate that very principle, and that has resulted in very large indebtedness also at country level. Finally, I want to finish with a quote, and that's a quote from an interview that I gave to the Economist Intelligence Unit that came to IE Business School in 2017. I was not the only person interviewed. There were 3 other faculty members. But I will only want to show the 2 quotes that were from me that were embedded in the article. The first one has to do with that corporations need to learn how to navigate uncertainty. And the reason is that change is now a constant. And velocity of change, especially whether it's market, technological, or product, is accelerating. That's number 1. Number 2 is that we also need both a compass and a radar. The compass will give us strategic direction, and we need strategic direction. That is the responsibility of the board as well. But what we also need is we need also a radar. That radar allows us to scan for discontinuities, and actually before they materialize. It's not only outside the organization, but it's also within the organization. We need to monitor corporate culture as well. Thank you very much.
Үлкен рахмет, большое спасибо. Вот. Енді бұл үлкен лекцияның жалғасы ретінде сұрақ-жауап сессиясын бастайық. Пожалуйста, вопросы. Это обсуждение. На это отводится 10 минут. Пожалуйста, воспользуйтесь.
Можно один вопрос? Дилет Адильбеков. Один из вопросов это по корпоративному управлению. В части возьмем кейс примерно. Мы сейчас приводим кейсы всех современных компаний, так если вернуться в историю, здесь возьмем как Османская империя. Это хороший кейс, который говорит об управлении, почему спустя 600 лет правления Османская империя пришла в упадок. У меня возникает вопрос, почему Османская империя, возьмем, что это корпорация, компания, почему они видели проблему и не реагировали на это, почему они видели важные изменения, но также не реагировали на это, и как, проведем параллель, что Османская империя – это своеобразная бизнес-корпорация, как не отстать от условий изменений на рынке. То есть зачастую в Османской империи проблематика была такая, то есть это корпоративное управление, соответственно, была проблематика, это большая империя, войны, неспособность дальше развиваться. Если западные страны уже начали развивать вооружение, то Османская империя до сих пор занималась земледелием. Также внутренние, скажем так, распри, интриги, неспособность, слабое управление, слабое принятие ответственности за принимаемые решения. Вот 3 вопроса ключевых у меня. Это почему компания видит проблему, но не реагирует на это, как вовремя заметить важные изменения на рынке, так как Османская империя – это тоже рынок, как бизнес, и как бизнесу не отстоять в условиях быстрых изменений, так как это основные 3 вопроса, которые влияют на крах или...
Thank you for those very easy questions. Luckily for me at least, about some of them I have been thinking. So let me first start maybe about the Ottoman Empire. And let me refer to 2 books. One was written by a business historian, Paul Kennedy, from Yale University, and it was called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. Number 2 is by Kenneth Rogoff. Kenneth Rogoff received his Nobel Prize in Economics, and he wrote a book, Globalization and Its Discontents. Now, these 2 books combined are actually remarkable written pieces of foresight that show how when you're at the top of your game, whether you're a company or a country, then the future is a relative decline. So if we think about globalization, is globalization a new phenomenon? The answer is no, it isn't a new phenomenon. It has been around for, let's say, 20th century. What we in the West very often forget is that India and China for 17 centuries were competing for economic dominance until the first industrial revolution, which was made in Britain. And then there was a shift in economic gravity from east to west. Now it's switching back to the east. And we in Europe and North America are surprised about this. We shouldn't have been surprised. In that case, the writing was already on the wall for a long period of time. The other thing I would say, and this is what we are observing in many countries, especially with the rise of the far right, is that many people have not benefited from globalization. And that's why Kenneth Rogoff referred to it as globalization and its discontents. Yes, globalization enhances the size of the pie, but is not very good at distribution. That's why in CG 4.0, I emphasize not only at sustainable and resilient, but also inclusive business growth. That basically everybody can get a fair slice of that pie. Now, I want to also address your question. How important is knowledge? Is that important? In Corporate Governance 4.0 competency framework, I have 4 areas of competencies: knowledge, skill, values, and mindset. And let me refer to a statement by Einstein that basically states that knowledge is actually not that important. But in education institutions and also in governance education, we focus on accumulation of knowledge. The question that he was asked was the following: what's the distance between Earth and the moon? Did Einstein know the answer? Of course he did. But he refused to answer the question. He said, I don't want to store in my memory what I can look up in a dictionary. Brilliant. Brilliant answer. What about critical thinking? What about mindsets? Are we actually educating leaders in terms of critical thinking and shifting their mindsets? And the answer is no. Very often not. I published yesterday an article on LinkedIn. Please have a look. And I argued that most directors are not fit for purpose. They should not be serving on a board today. because they don't have the critical thinking ability, nor do they have the mindset ability. And this is what actually hinders us to evolve going forward as a human species, whether this is a country level or whether this is a business level. And I don't want to become philosophical, but in essence, that's what we're dealing with. And we have a responsibility as governance leaders to actually make a change. That's our responsibility that we have. Unfortunately, we are failing that responsibility, and that actually includes me. Thank you. I hope that answers to some degree your question.
Рахмет, спасибо. Пожалуйста.
Можно? Қош келдіңіз, Александра Ван мырза. У меня вопрос, вот как вам видится вот через 5-10 лет сильные сигналы для университетов? Также я хотел спросить, вот именно какие решения могут совету может делегировать искусственному интеллекту, связано с этим? Спасибо.
Luckily for me, I don't have all the answers here, but luckily for me, it's also something that I've reflected upon myself, but also with colleagues at IE and also at other universities. First of all, AI is not new. AI emerged in 1956 at the Dartmouth conference. And I studied it in the 1980s when I was studying computer science. It has evolved a lot. And we tend to think about generative AI and also agentic AI, but there are new forms of AI emerging too. Now, I don't know whether you're familiar with the future of work of the World Economic Forum. McKinsey is also focusing on that quite extensively. And there is no doubt that most jobs could actually be automated. I say most jobs. The question is, will these jobs or should these jobs be automated? Even if they can. And the answer is probably not. And the reason is because if all these jobs are going to be automated, we'll likely have a lot of social unrest. And this is where then, but let's assume that we're in a scenario where most jobs are automated and that governments actually allow this to happen as well. What do we then do with people that have no jobs, no income? Professor Schiller from Yale University, who also received the Nobel Prize in Economics, advocated for a universal income, whether you work or not. So with AI, we would be able to grow the size of the pie even more than in a traditional way. But then if a lot of people are unemployed and have nothing to do, how do we make sure that actually they have a job? Now, I don't think that scenario is very plausible. I think that a more plausible scenario is that governments will increasingly focus on putting guardrails in place. And it depends on where you are in the world as well. If you look at the governance of AI in China, the US, or Western Europe, it's very different. Let me start with Western Europe. Western Europe, when you have certain ways to govern, let's say AI, they're always going to think about what are the implications for people in society. We've seen that with GDPR. We've seen that with the Cybersecurity Act. We've seen that with the AI Act. They're always concerned about privacy of citizens and what the implications are for citizens. In the United States, it's a very different matter. And what does it mean is that in the United States, anything is possible, almost anything is possible, because the focus is really more on enhancing the size of the pie with limited guardrails imposed by the government. And of course, it depends who's going to be in the White House. In the United States, in China, on the other hand, anything is possible again, except if it would affect the power structure of the central party. So what does that mean? That basically means that we need a global framework on AI that puts proper guardrails in place, but without affecting the ability to compete. So in essence, it's also about ambidexterity. On the one hand, it's the guardrails to protect. On the other hand, it is the ability to compete and the ability to create uncontested markets, but without having negative consequences on society. Now, one of the things that can be most easily automated is actually the role of most professors, whether we like it or not. We can be automated, and we're now here at the education institution. I'm already, and my colleagues at IE Business School in Madrid, we're making heavily use of AI in curriculum design, even in the way that we solve problems. And some of the problems can be solved easier than other problems. If you think about accounting, for example, I wonder what the future of accountants is going to be, because it's very rules-based. And therefore, AI can easily fill in their role. If, on the other hand, you have a professor of philosophy, that becomes a little bit more difficult to automate. So it's not universally the case that can be automated, but if we don't embrace AI in the classroom, and also, but also prevent that students will lack the ability to think critically, then we will go also as an education institution, potentially go the way of the dinosaur. So it's about embracing it, but in a responsible way, number one. Number two, not affecting the ability of our graduates to think critically. And that's going to be key. When I graduated a long time ago from business school, the dean said, you need three things. You need three things. And I still remember that, and I would argue it's still the case today. One is, first of all, you need education. You just graduated, and then he tells you education. What it means is actually, it's a commitment to lifelong learning. He used education, because it stands for one of the three E's. The other two E's are ethical values. And what would the third one be? Ethical values, education, and, well, that I would say everybody would need. I forgot the third one. How is that possible? That's why I was trying for Karat's help here. You need education, ethical values, and it'll come back to me. But what trying to refer to, ethical values are always going to be critical. And very often we've forgotten about our ethical values. Doing the right thing, in essence. Yes.
Рахмет. Спасибо. Так, пожалуйста, представьтесь вопросы.
You go. Dear colleagues, dear rector of the university, Professor Van and director of the National Academy of Corporate Governance, Rector Abdray, my name is Dana, and I'm a former alumni of Eurasian National University, and very happy and very honored to be here today. And of course, Professor Van it's thank you very much for such interesting lecture, thought-provoking and very insightful. Currently, I'm working as a corporate secretary of the national company. So I would like to clarify one point regarding the practical implementation of the corporate governance 4 in different governance systems. As I understand from the lecture, the concept of the ambassadorial board requires a high level of strategic involvement of the board in both exploration and exploration activities. However, in Kazakhstan, we follow a two-tier governance board, as you know, where the board of directors is structurally separated from the executive management. And therefore, my question is does the corporate governance 4 model imply that for effective implementation, companies should move closer to one tier structure? For example, by including more top management representatives in the board of executive, or can the executive board be fully achieved within a 2-tier system through changes in process and board practices rather than in its composition?
Thank you for your question. First of all, I would like to express that I have great, the third E was experience, by the way, came back, that I have great admiration for a company secretary. Many people here will be able to attest that. By the way, I also am a chartered company secretary, although I never served as a company secretary on a board. The CG 4.0 operates equally well within a single tier and a dual tier board. I understand that the role in a dual tier board, and I've been on boards in Kazakhstan, is more the oversight by the supervisory board, and that the management board actually looks therefore more at the exploration part. Where in a unitary board, like we have in the United Kingdom, but also the United States, we actually, the independent directors and the executive directors together focus on both the exploitation and the exploration. So it's basically that the role is split between the supervisory board and the management board. Now, what I also wanted to emphasize is the critical role of the company secretary here. One of my very good friends, Simon Osborne, and he used to be the CEO of the Chartered Governance Institute, and he was a company secretary himself. He refers to as the company secretary as the conscience of the organization. And so it's much more than an administrative role. So especially when you have a dual tier board, like you have in Kazakhstan, but also in Germany and in Brazil, the role of the company secretary is even more important because you have to make sure that the supervisory board and the management board speak the same language. That is your duty and responsibility as a company secretary to ensure that. But otherwise, I don't see any reason why CG 4.0 would be less effective in a dual tier board structure than it would be in a unitary board structure. In fact, there are benefits of both systems. It depends how it's going to be applied within the local legal jurisdiction. That's the key, I would say. But it has nothing to do, in essence, the way that the board is actually organized. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I add 2 more questions? What specific tools and processes do you recommend implementing at the board level to systematically identify weak signals and transform them into strategic decisions? And another one, can corporate governance 4 be seen as a new paradigm of the corporate governance that requires as a revision of national corporate governance? Thank you so much.
Well, let me start with the first. What was the first one again? About, how to, yes, the weak signals. Every organization is different. And the way that, but if you think about this, and other intelligence agencies. So I know pretty well how the CIA functioned. So but also look at NVIDIA, for example. So whether you, at any of these institutions, and also Shell, where I used to work, the weak signal detection was coordinated from the center. It was not collected from the center. It was coordinated from the center, and that's key. It was collected through a deeply decentralized, empowered organization. So the CIA, its operatives around the world, very often unknown people because of security reasons, national security reasons. If you look at NVIDIA, anybody in the organization can directly write to Jensen Wang. And they're encouraged to talk to colleagues, talk to employers, not employers, to employees, but also talk to customers, suppliers, former professors, anybody who actually see some of the weak signals emerging. And then that would then be channeled up to the center where they would make sense of it. Now, what also in NVIDIA they then invite some of those employees who are not part of the C-suite or the level below, but anywhere in the organization to take part in whiteboarding sessions. So one of the things that I've been mentioning to Dr. Calembetto for many times is we should not have a single time a year a strategy session. Strategy and risk should be on every single board agenda. So during these whiteboarding sessions, which happen about 20 times a year, they actually think about what does that mean for our organization. So that strategy becomes a dynamic capability as opposed to something static that you do once a year. So I work a lot on scenarios. And one of the first things that I tell my students, I don't want to hear the word planning in my course. If you hear planning, you get a yellow card. You get 2 yellow cards, you have to leave the course. And nobody has ever received a red card. Because planning, what does it imply? We make a decision today and we find out what is the outcome going to be in the future. In an uncertain environment, it does not work. Instead, what we do, we navigate uncertainty. We spot the weak signals, and based on how these weak signals unfold, we scale up investments, we hold investments, or we abandon investments. And companies like Alphabet, NVIDIA are doing this better than any other company that I know of. Your second question was about
It's a new paradigm.
the new paradigm.
Yeah.
Well,
Especially for the corporate governance codes in Kazakhstan, national corporate governance codes.
Well, corporate governance codes need to evolve around the world, for sure. Do they need to be compliance-based? Yes. Compliance is critical. Remember, 1992, the Cadbury Report was designed for a reason. And by the way, Cadbury Report still lives on today. But the codes have been modified with also having the long-term perspective in mind. Now, that said, I would say that with Corporate Governance 4.0, I'm not trying to change any codes. I want to have another layer, a meta framework that basically can be used in any jurisdiction. And that requires actually also a different set of competencies. I think it's more about the competencies than it is about the codes. And especially not the knowledge and skills competencies, which corporate governance certifications are very well at addressing. I've completed 5 of these over time. What they're not very good at, it's shaping mindsets of current and future leaders. And this is where our gap is. It's the mindsets. We fear uncertainty. Stop fearing uncertainty. Understand the uncertainty. And we will do much, much better, because then collectively as a board, we can actually translate that into opportunity, and especially in more sustainable, more resilient and inclusive outcomes. Let me ask you one question. Talking about resilience, what was the economic cost of COVID-19 in 2020 alone? Any thought here? Economic cost, not social cost, economic cost. Some people will say the economy contracted by 5%. Actually, it was 4.9%, but let's round it to 5% of a $90 trillion economy at the time. So that's 4.5 trillion. Is that the end of the story? No, because the IMF had anticipated that the economy would grow by 3%. So we can add 2.7 trillion to it. So we're at 8.2 trillion. Is that the end of the story? Again, the answer is no. Why? Because if you look at that small little number, GDP, when you break it down in its underlying components, consumer spending, government spending, investment by the private sector, and exports minus imports, and exports minus imports is zero at the global level, then what happened is that C stayed the same. We just switched to different consumption. And I and G went up by a whopping 19.3 trillion. And it was all debt financed. That needs to be serviced, needs to be paid back. So please add the 19 trillion to the 8.2, and we're in excess of 25 trillion. That was 2020 alone. In 2021, it was the same. So my question to all of us is, how often can we still bail ourselves out of a shock in the external environment? So yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen wrote that the cost of, since the invasion of Ukraine, but also currently the war in Iran, on energy was 25 billion. She's totally wrong. It's much, much more if you look at the true economic cost. And again, it could have been completely prevented. So when are we going to wake up and smell the coffee, ladies and gentlemen? When are we going to internalize externalities? And we cannot do it unilaterally. We actually have to do it collectively. So all of these things could have been prevented, but also all of these things have been anticipated. I knew that Israel and the US was going to attack Iran. That was clear already a long time ago. I knew that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. That was very clear. So, but if you fail to look at the weak signals, then are you worth the title of leader? Ask yourself that question. Thank you.
Рахмет. Енді осы тамаша жауаптарменен біз сұрақ жауап сессиясын аяқтайық.
Кешіріңіздер, сұрақ қойсам болады ма?
Сұрақ қой. Онда соңғы бір сұрақ болсын. Пожалуйста. Өзіңізді таныстырып кетіңіз.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this session. Thousand appreciates Mr. Alexandra for the insights from your speech. And may I ask you a question, please, from your experience? What is the most impactful role of a corporate security can play in helping the board shift from a reactive to a more foresight, maybe driven approach to governance? I'm really interested about this question because I'm an assistant of corporate security. And that's the reason why I'm asking. Thank you, sir.
When you refer to a question for any kind of security, well, let me maybe talk about cybersecurity. The reason why cybersecurity is because every board should be carefully thinking about it. The global cost of cybercrime is in the range of $10 trillion of an economy that's 120. So we're talking about roughly 8%. That's the cost of global cybercrime. Unfortunately, many of the cybercrimes are sponsored by nation states, about 70 to 80%. And this is not something we should leave over to the technical team. We should integrate it as part of our approach to enterprise risk management. And ultimately, it is a role of the board to provide oversight over it. But what is also very important is that when you develop, for example, a significant cyber breach, what kind of disruptive risk would that be? Would that be a black swan, gray rhino, or white elephant? A specific one I would refer to as a black swan event. You don't know when or where it will happen. That basically means that you need to have a contingency plan. And the contingency plan is not just something that is on a bookshelf, is also something that you're going to put in practice. You're going to rehearse it. I don't know whether you heard about red team tactics. Red team tactics is basically that the attack happens from within the organization as if it's a real attack. And then basically the board convenes in order to deal with the entire situation. Of course, it's not a real attack. It is a simulated attack. But the key is that you simulate potential incidents. Now, you said you look at security. You can apply this to any type of security. But I picked cybersecurity because cybersecurity is so significant and can affect any company of any size. So it is a responsibility of the board. Number one, you need to be prepared. Number three, you need to simulate it. So that basically, again, you need to see it quickly. You need to isolate it quickly. You need to neutralize it quickly. Let me use an example of what happened last year when several airports in Europe faced a cyber attack. It took, when you have a cyber attack, you have to be able to say within 3 hours that it's a cyber attack. It took them, initially they thought it was a IT glitch. It took them 3 days to say, yes, it is a cyber attack. If you don't know what the cause is, how are you going to be able to isolate it quickly? How are you going to be able to neutralize it quickly? That was an example of a governance failure in terms of a cybersecurity breach. You have to be able to see it quickly. You have to be able to isolate it quickly. You have to be able to neutralize it quickly. That's simple. But very often we fail to meet any of these criteria. But it starts with the upstream part. We need to see it quickly. Give it a name and understand what it all is. Thank you.
Рахмет барлықтарыңызға. Осыменен сұрақ жауап сессиясын аяқтаймыз. Енді сіздердің рұқсаттарыңызбенен біз салтанатты кезеңіне отырысымыздың ауысуға рұқсат етіңіздер. Позвольте перейти к более торжественному этапу нашей встречи. Это единогласным решением ученого совета Евразийского национального университета имени Гумилева присвоено звание почетного профессора нашего университета господину Вандер Путте Александру. Позвольте эту церемонию здесь. Астыға түзекті күлтегін атриумында фотографирование и торжественное вручение дипломов выпускникам.